Like the other three FRQs, it's worth 12.5% of your total FRQ portion grade, and it's worth 4 points. This is also one of my favorite FRQs because you get to sing a little song to remember what you have to do, but we'll get to that in just a second. All right, let's go over some general tips. First of all, it's important to note that with this FRQ, it is a chart, data, bar graph, whatever it may be, skill read. Okay, so part A is always going to ask you to use some kind of skill reading the data that you've been given. So that's where my little song comes in. Data, data, data. Remember to cite the data. Okay, now the data might be in a bar graph, a line graph, a pie chart. It might just be a table. The one we're going to look at today is actually a map. So the most important thing for you to do in part A is cite the data, and you need to cite the specific data. And when I say specific data, in our example today, it's going to be a state name, but it's usually like a percentage or a date or some kind of numeric number or a year, anything very specific that lets the reader know that you can read and interpret the non-text that's given to you. Point B, or part B, is going to generally ask you to identify a pattern or a trend. So it's important that we can recognize the difference. A trend generally refers to a direction over time, while a pattern refers to a repeating observation. So make sure when you're reading part B, you know whether or not they're asking for a trend or a pattern. It's also usually necessary and a really good idea to cite the data in your part B response as well. It's almost kind of hard not to do that, but when in doubt on this FRQ, whenever and wherever you can cite specific data, you should definitely do it. All right, so point C, one of the most important things you can do for part C is check the prompt, because a lot of times your part C is going to be directly connected to your part B. We're going to see this in the sample we're going to look at today in particular. So usually part B is going to ask you to describe that trend or that pattern, and then part C is going to ask you to do something based on that trend or pattern that you identified in part B. So it's going to be really important that you cite the data again if it's appropriate to do so in part B, and then also that you're referencing whatever that trend or pattern was in part B, if that type of FRQ is specifically referring back to part B. And then last but not least in part B, this is where you're going to have to expand your knowledge outside the FRQ or outside the data that's presented and connect it to course concepts. Generally speaking, they're going to ask you to explain something. They may also ask you to show some relevant information. All right, so let's take a look at this sample FRQ. So in this case, we have a map. So we're going to use this map to answer all parts of the FRQ. The first thing you want to do with any quantitative analysis FRQ is look at what you've got. So we've got a map of the United States. It does include Alaska and Hawaii. We have a title that says top state marginal individual income tax rates for 2018. We have a legend, and we have a bunch of different colorations across these states. So as mentioned before, our part A is going to ask a specific question. I would also encourage you for the rest of this session, after we go over each part, take a pause, hit pause on the video, craft your response, and then restart the video to check your work. That way you get a chance to kind of do this FRQ along with me. So part A says to identify a state with a state income tax rate between 2% and 5%. So in this case, we know our part A answer is going to have a state name. That's going to be our specific data. And we're looking for a state that has a tax rate between 2 and 5%. So if we look at the legend, we can see that we're looking for kind of that dark but not darkest gray color. So if I'm looking at my map, I'm going to give you some circles here of all the different places where we're seeing kind of a majority of these states. So go ahead and pause your video now and craft your response. All right, so an answer for part A could be Arizona is a state that has a state income tax rate between 2% and 5%. Now you can see from the circles, you could have picked any number of states here. I just happened to pick Arizona. So there is more than one answer for this part A. All right, let's move on to part B. So part B is asking us to describe a pattern. So remember that a pattern generally refers to a repeating observation, different than a trend. So we're going to look at our map and we're going to see where might we see some patterns. So go ahead and pause the video. play when you're ready.
I need to find the calculator math and science. It's really in that order. What?
Okay, so the pattern I decided to look at was between the northeast and the southeast. Because if you look, you can see a pretty big difference in the state income tax rates comparatively. So my answer is a pattern shown in the map indicates that states in the northeastern part of the United States tend to have higher income taxes than states in the southeast. So that doesn't mean that the entire northeast is higher or that the entire southeast is lower, okay? But we do see a pattern between these two areas of the country. Again, you may have chosen a different pattern. This is just the one that I chose based on this data. All right, let's move on to part C. So as I mentioned in the general tips, this is a type of FRQ that is going to connect directly back to what we just said in part B. So I just said that the pattern was between the northeast and the southeast, with the northeast having a higher state income tax level. So now I'm going to have to draw a conclusion about how the ideologies of the political parties shape the pattern that I described in part B. So as a reminder, my two patterns focus on these two areas of the country. Also remember, when an FRQ is talking about ideologies, generally speaking, we want to use words like liberal and conservative rather than Republican and Democrat. You can use both, but just remember ideologies generally refers to liberal conservative. Whereas if it said parties and just parties, then it would refer to Republicans and Democrats. So go ahead and pause your video, craft your response, and hit play when you're ready. Okay, for this one I'm going to provide you with two different answers. One conclusion that can be drawn about the ideologies of the political parties and the pattern described in part B is that states with higher income taxes are likely Democratic states and thus more liberal. These states are more likely to support Keynesian economic theory, which promotes economic growth by spending money on social and other programs. You could answer part C with just that answer. Or you could have chosen to answer it this way. One conclusion that can be drawn about the ideologies of the political parties and the pattern described in part B is that states with lower income taxes are likely Republican states and thus more conservative. These states are more likely to support supply-side economics, which promotes economic growth through lower taxes. Okay, so you would not need to answer both of these for part C. I just gave you one side discussing the liberal states and one side discussing the conservative. So either option would work for part C. All right, so our final part D is going to make us connect what we have seen in the chart, the patterns we've been talking about, to something else. In this case, we're going to explain how state income tax rates, as illustrated on the map, demonstrates the varied perspectives on economic policy making. So two things of importance here for part D. Number one, we're focusing on those state income taxes and how they're different across the country by state. And then we also have to make some reference to economic policy and how there might be different perspectives on that throughout the states and how that might impact what the state income tax rates are. So go ahead and pause your video, craft your response, and hit play when you're ready. possible answer for Part D. The state income tax rates, as illustrated on the map, demonstrate varied perspectives on economic policymaking because liberals and conservatives have different viewpoints on how economic policy should be made. Liberals generally support a Keynesian economic policy to support growth, which often advocates increased tax revenues from individuals, while conservatives generally support a supply-side economic policy to support growth, which often advocates for individual tax cuts and or lower tax rates. So in this one, it's important that you discuss both sides of the argument because the question is asking about the varied perspectives. So it's important that you discuss those varied perspectives on economic policymaking in your response.